So good job cleaning up the media player resources as soon as you didn't need them anymore. So you're already following the best practices of Android development. Well, at least for the most part. Now I want to tell you some more details that will require us to modify our code just a little bit more. So the issue is that we've been operating under the assumption that the user will always stay within our app. Well, what if the user decides to switch away to, say, a web browser, or even head over to a phone call? Well, if the user is not actively looking at our app, we can't finish executing our code and clean up the media player resources. So if the user switches over to several other apps and never comes back to our Miwok app, then eventually Android will destroy our activity so that it can use those resources to run the more recent apps that the user is interacting with. So as a developer, we have to be ready for the user to leave our activity at any time, or for the system to destroy our activity because it needs those resources for something else. So for example, in an email app, the developer is responsible for storing the latest version of the user's email draft, so that when the user returns to the app, even after days or months, it appears as if they've never left the app. Now in this case, the developer should indicate to the system that it's interested in knowing when the user leaves the current activity, and at that point, the developer should save off the latest version of the email draft. So later, when the user comes back to the activity, the email draft should be populated on screen. So it would be bad if they came back to the email draft that they were writing, and the screen was just completely blank, because the changes that they made were never saved off. So all this behavior is driven by the need to conserve memory resources on a device. So Android wants to have enough resources so that the current app that the user is interacting with is fast, responsive, and the resources aren't wasted on apps that the user hasn't interacted with in a while. So in order to provide structure to all the chaos that could be happening on a device, Android has a lifecycle that all the activities can follow. So the system will handle transitioning the activity from one stage of the lifecycle to another, and it offers callbacks so that you as a developer can get notified when these changes happen in your activity. So when you get notified, you can take that opportunity to execute certain instructions that you need. So let's discuss other states that the activity can be in. When an activity is first launched, it's created, and then started, and then resumed. Now at this point, the activity is active, and the user can interact with it. So as soon as the user moves to a different activity or a different app, then this activity moves into a pause state, and then into a stop state, and if it is closed out, then it becomes destroyed. So if the user comes back to this activity, then it gets restarted, and we move back into the started state. And now the user can interact with it once again. So here I've shown you a simplified activity lifecycle diagram so that you could first grasp a high-level overview of what's happening. So in the official Android documentation, in the starting an activity section, we have a full activity lifecycle diagram here. So this diagram is a little bit more complex than the one I showed you earlier, but the main idea is the same. So remember that the Android system is responsible for transitioning your activity into each of these states. So you as a developer can't control which state that you're in. So starting from here, when your activity is launched, the activity is moved into the created state using the onCreate method. And then it's moved into the started state using the onStart method. So at this point, it becomes visible to the user. And so from there, it's moved into the resume state via the onResume method. And in this case, the activity is still visible to the user, but the user can now start interacting with the activity. So here you can display animations, use sensors like location sensors, or even use the camera on the device. So the activity can stay in the resume state for however long the user is looking at the screen. So that could be minutes or hours or even longer. Now, as soon as your user switches to a different activity, then your activity is paused via the onPause method. And from there, it moves into the stop state via the onStop method. So at this point, the activity is no longer visible to the user. So since your user can't see the activity, if the system determines that your activity is no longer needed, the system may destroy your activity via the onDestroy method in order to free up resources on the device. And then your activity would enter the destroyed state. But otherwise, your activity could just stay in the stop state. Then if your user decides to come back to the activity before it's destroyed, then the activity is restarted via the onRestart method. And then it moves back into the started state via the onStart method. And then finally, back into the resume state via the onResume method.